Hello everyone and welcome to another MTG Top 10. I'm Nitsahone and I bring you a new Top 10 list each and every week. This week we're looking at a subtype of artifacts, equipment. Equipment debuted way back in Mirrodin block, and since then almost 230 pieces of equipment have been printed. In this list we're going to pick the 10 best out of those 230 based on how successful they've been at the highest level of competitive Magic. This week's MTG Top 10 is sponsored by MTG Amino, a great app for Magic the Gathering, so let me take a moment to tell you a little bit about this app before we get into the list. Amino has a lot of apps for various interests. One of them is on Magic the Gathering. It's basically a social network for people who love Magic the Gathering. You have sort of a news feed of everyone talking about Magic the Gathering on the app. You can find people talking about whatever it is you're interested in Magic the Gathering, basically. For me, I like looking at what people did in draft, so I look at a lot of pictures of what people drafted because I love limited, but you can find something on there for any one of your Magic the Gathering interests. Polls are one of the many features on MTG Amino, and right now you can vote in a poll to help determine what a future top 10 will be, and the app is available in both Android and iPhone, and you can find a link in the description below. So a quick reminder on how I score these. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they've received, with the Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. The cards in this list are arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. I do also consider Legacy and Vintage Championship events as Pro Tour Top 8s, so that those formats can properly be represented in the scores of the cards. Now let's get started with number 10. At number 10, we have Behemoth Sledge, the only colored artifact to make this list. It was part of a cycle of colored equipment, but it is the only one that makes this list. Granting Trample and Lifelink has been a potent combination ever since the days of Armadillo Cloak, making your creature bigger, giving it an evasive ability, and making it so that your opponent can't really race you thanks to Lifelink is pretty powerful. It really only saw play in Standard, and as you might expect, it was in decks that ran a lot of creatures who could hold this sledge. It saw play in Doran, the Siege Tower decks, and in Naya and Zoo decks, with Luis Scott Vargas playing it in his Boss Naya deck that top-8'd Pro Tour San Diego in 2010. Its equip and casting costs are a little too hefty to see play in any non-rotating formats, so it's unlikely it ever will. The next competitive piece of equipment that comes along will probably be bumping Behemoth Sledge off of this list. At number 9, we have one of the biggest mistakes Wizards ever made, a card that makes Smuggler's Copter look like garbage, Skull Clamp. If it weren't for the fact that it was quickly banned out of basically all formats, it would undoubtedly be number 1 on this list. Once in play, it basically served as a 1-mana draw 2 card effect in decks with lots of small creatures, like Affinity and Goblins, which were already the 2 most dominant decks in Standard at the time, so it made them even better. Immediately after being printed, its dominance was evident. The first Standard event after it was printed was Grand Prix Brussels in 2004. 5 of the top 8 decks ran 4 copies of Skull Clamp, and that was 3 Goblin decks and 2 Affinity decks. The card was printed in April, and it was banned in June of the same year. While it was briefly legal in block, it also picked up 2 Pro Tour Top 8s at Pro Tour Kobe in 2004. When Wizards realized their mistake, they banned it, and they shared with us how it is that such a broken card got printed, giving us an interesting look inside Magic R&D. Sort of similar to what happened with Vehicles in Kaladesh, the development team decided that late into development they were going to push these new card types, the equipment. With only a month before the cards were going to be finalized, Skull Clamp went from being a 3-mana equipment with the cost of 2 that gave a creature +1/+2 and had, when equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards, to becoming the monstrosity that you see before you. They realized the card was ridiculous when it was too late to make the change and the card was printed. They waited for people to do broken things with it, and they did, and they quickly banned it. Skull Clamp is only legal in Vintage, and it doesn't see any play there, but it did manage to put up 9 points for the brief time it was legal in Standard and Block. So, for now, it makes the list. It's also an EDH staple, so it'll always have that. At number 8, we have Basileus Collar. This is an equipment that doesn't offer any stats boost, but it gives a creature 2 powerful keywords, Lifelink and Death Touch. As already mentioned, Lifelink is a nightmare to race, and Death Touch is nice because it makes your creature difficult to interact with if your opponent doesn't want to lose their own creatures. In Standard, it primarily saw play in Boros aggro decks that were heavy with the landfall mechanic and could make huge creatures that could gain you a ton of life. Sometimes it was a sideboard card to help against other aggro decks, but it also saw some mainboard play. It also saw play in Naya while in Standard. In Extended, it picked up a Pro Tour Top 8 in a Doran Siege Tower deck and a Grand Prix Top 8 in a Vengevine deck. In just the last few months, it has begun to see play in Modern in Eldrazi Tron. The collar goes nice on big Eldrazi and all, but it combos the best with Walking Ballista, which can then machine gun your opponent's entire board with the help of the collar. Eldrazi Tron seems well positioned in Modern right now, so it seems likely that Basileus Collar will continue to climb. At number 7, we have one of the first equipment ever printed, Loxodon Warhammer. Basically a colorless Behemoth Sledge that doesn't also boost toughness. A card like Warhammer doesn't seem super incredible to us today, but just like the Sledge, it created huge problems for your opponent thanks to having a now huge creature that makes it impossible for your opponent to race you because of all the life gain. However, when it was first printed in Mirrodin in 2004, it was certainly a limited all-star, but it didn't really see any play in Constructed. However, it was printed at Rare, probably because of how ridiculous it wasn't limited, in both 9th and 10th edition, and with those printings, Locks It on Warhammer saw some play. It saw the most play in Fairies decks, which could equip evasive creatures that did all kinds of damage in the air and also gained you a ton of life. Merfolk decks and Elf decks also ran it, as it could make your small guys into real threats. However, it hasn't been reprinted since 2009, and it is an unlikely candidate to see play in non-rotating formats. At number 6, we have Mordor Pod. Mordor Pod came with a living weapon mechanic, meaning that it came into play with a 0/0 germ creature token that the equipment would automatically be attached to. This was a cool mechanic that made equipment more efficient than it had been before, since it came into play already equipped to something. Mordor Pod is an interesting card because one's first instinct when they read it would be that it's not amazing. It offers a small stats boost and lets you sacrifice the creature it is equipped to do 1 damage to a creature or player. Re-equipping it for 2 every time you do this isn't exactly efficient, however, it found a home in competitive decks. In Block, it saw some play putting up 2 Pro Tour top 8s, 1 in Infect and 1 in a Pure Steel Paladin deck with tons of other equipment. The place people will most remember it from, though, is Standard, where it was run alongside cards like Gravecrawler, who never stayed dead, so you could basically do as much damage as you had mana, and it also ran cards like Blood Artist, which drained the opponent every time one of your creatures died, so you're actually doing 2 at a time. Mordor Pod provided a lot of reach for those decks. If your opponent managed to stabilize against your aggro game, Mordor Pod could close out the game over a few turns. It also saw play in decks without zombies in them, though, including Delver, Green-White Aggro, and Cawblade. Any deck that could use a bunch of creatures as fodder in the late game wanted to run Mordor Pod because it provided removal that was actually good in a format that had lots of X1s. It was also removal that couldn't be countered once the Mordor Pod was in play. It didn't only see play in Standard, though. It wasn't in Extended for long, but it followed a similar pattern there, being run in Vengevine decks, a deck that also happened to have Gravecrawler in it, and in White Weenie decks. In Legacy, it has 1 Grand Prix top 8 and an Elf deck from Grand Prix Ghent in 2012. Mordor Pod's best days seem to be behind it, though, as it hasn't seen play anywhere in almost 5 years. At number 5, we have what is my personal favorite piece of equipment, Runechanter's Pike. If you have watched some of my other videos, you know I love Spells Matter type decks, and obviously Runechanter's Pike fits nicely into such a deck. Putting it on an evasive creature with a ton of instants and sorceries in my graveyard is a dream I've lived many times, and so have a lot of other people. Runechanter's Pike combined especially well with Delver of Secrets. Both cards wanted you to run a ton of instants and sorceries, and they also comboed well together, as an insectile aberration wielding Runechanter's Pike is a frightening thing to behold. The Pike saw play almost exclusively in blue-white Delver decks while it was in Standard. Unfortunately, the Pike is a bit too clunky for Delver decks in non-rotating formats and hasn't seen play since it rotated out of Standard, but it has been wielded by a lot of insectile aberrations. At number 4, I did what I do from time to time on these lists. I sort of cheated by including more than 1 card. These 4 cards are all part of the same mega cycle of cards, though, and all of them are good for more or less the same reasons. I wanted to include all 4 of them together so we had an opportunity to talk about a few more cards and their history. In terms of score, Sword of Feast and Famine is the only one that is a legit number 4 on this list. Sword of War and Peace would have come in at number 5, Body and Mind would have been number 8, and Fire and Ice would have been number 9. All of these swords cost 3 to play and 2 to equip, and offer +2/+2 in protection from the colors hinted at by the card's name. They also come with another powerful block of text, where, when the creature they are equipped to does damage, you get 2 effects, each sort of embodying one of the 2 aspects of the card. Feast and Famine has seen the most success in the group. It forces your opponent to pitch their hand, which is the Famine part, and you get to untap all your lands, which is the Feast part. The first 3 of the cards you see here hugely benefited from the presence of Stoneforge Mystic in the same Standard, which allowed you to tutor up equipment when it came into play, and allowed you to put it into play for 2 more mana. Cawblade was the deck that abused this the most, and eventually Stoneforge Mystic got banned. The sword stayed legal, though, and continued to see play, though not at quite as dominant of a rate. In Standard, Sword of Feast and Famine saw some play in Kessig Titan, Green-White Aggro, and Blue-White Delver decks, in addition to Cawblade. It also saw play in Extended, while the Mystic was legal in there, and it sees play in Legacy 2, a format where Stoneforge Mystic is legal. Sword of War and Peace offers protection from red and white, and makes it so that when your creature hits your opponent, you'll do damage equal to the number of cards in your opponent's hand to them, that's the war part, and you gain life equal to the number of cards in your hand, the peace part. This could lead to some pretty massive amounts of damage. It also saw play in Cawblade while the Mystic was legal, mostly in the same decks as Sword of Feast and Famine, both before and after the banning. It doesn't quite catch up to Feast and Famine because it saw less play in other formats, though, only putting up 5 points in Modern. Body and Mind saw significantly less play than War and Peace and Feast and Famine. This is because it doesn't offer as relevant a protection. Protection from black, red, and white stopped a lot of removal. Blue and green, not so much. It also didn't have the most powerful of abilities when the creature it is equipped to does combat damage, making a 2/2 wolf, the body part, and milling the top 10 cards of your opponent's library, the mind part. It was played in Caw-Blade, but at a much smaller rate, really only showing up in metagames where the protection seemed better. Finally, Sword of Fire and Ice, along with Light and Shadow, which didn't make this list, started this cycle way back in Darksteel. It didn't have the benefit of being legal in Standard alongside Stoneforge Mystic, but it saw play anyway because it was pretty powerful, offering protection from red and blue, and letting you shock something, the fire part, and draw a card, the ice part, anytime the creature it was equipped to did combat damage. It only picked up 3 points in Standard though, all of those points coming in Goblin decks. However, it saw some play in Extended in Fairies decks. In Legacy, it has done the most work, having become part of a Death and Taxes deck which, you guessed it, runs Stoneforge Mystic. It is actually the one of these four that has seen play the most recently and seems to have become the sword that Stoneforge Mystic decks are most interested in running in Legacy right now, and it stands a chance to eventually move up on the hierarchy of swords here. At number 3, we have Cranium Plating, a card from one of the most unbalanced cycles of cards ever. Every card in the cycle costs 2 to play and 1 to equip, and could be equipped at instant speed for 2 colored mana. You've probably never even heard of the other cards in the cycle because they aren't that good, but Cranium Plating finds itself as the 3rd best equipment of all time. It has really only seen play in one deck, but that deck has been dominant across a variety of formats, and that deck is of course Affinity. Affinity runs a ton of artifacts, and it also runs evasive creatures like Vault Scourge who make the plating an even bigger problem. In Standard it picked up 6 points in Affinity, and would have picked up more if not for the multiple bannings that were put in place to cripple the deck. In Extended, there's a similar story. Saw some success before Affinity was weakened by bannings. Modern is where Affinity has really been able to shine. While there are bannings in place to keep it from being too good, such as the artifact lands, it is still one of the best decks in the format, and has been since Modern was created. It has a real shot to be the eventual number 1 on this list, but it has a way to go to catch number 2 and number 1 who are in a very tight race. At number 2, we have another famously overpowered card, Umezawa's Jitte. Jitte has made appearances on 2 other MTG top 10s, doing well enough to be the 4th best artifact in the history of Magic, and it was the number 1 legendary artifact in the history of Magic. The Jitte is an interesting card because it was incredibly underrated during spoiler season, but it turned out to be incredibly good, as we know now. 2 to play and 2 to equip for no immediate bonus was rough, but just as soon as you get in once with the Jitte, it snowballs. You can use the charge counters for all sorts of things, pumping the creature, giving a creature -1/-1, or gaining life. The flexibility of Jitte was great, as all of those abilities have a time and place. The Jitte was sort of the smuggler's copter of its time, and everyone in both Block and Standard just tried to shove it into their deck. After Pro Tour Honolulu, a Standard Pro Tour in 2006, where the Jitte appeared in 6 of the top 8 deck lists, it got banned out of Standard. However, it wasn't deemed too strong for Extended, and it continued to see play there in all manners of creature-based decks, including Fairies, Elves, and Zoo. It never saw play in Modern because, when the format was created, it was a card that appeared on the initial ban list. The Jitte continues to see play in both Legacy and Vintage, though, where it can be played alongside our friend Stoneforge Mystic, but it even sees play in basically any creature-based deck, including Death and Taxes, Shardless Bug, and Merfolk. It even picked up a top 8 at the Vintage Championships, a pretty good indication of how strong this card is. At number 1, beating Umezawa's Jitte by only 1 point, we have Batterskull. It's so good that it was the number 3 artifact of all time, also narrowly coming ahead of Jitte there, and it took number 1 on my top 10 list on Lifelink. Batterskull, like the swords, really saw a ton of play thanks to Stoneforge Mystic. The Mystic, as we noted before, can tutor things up and then cheat them into play at instant speed, but it was a really good deal with Batterskull because it normally costs 5 mana, and it gave you a 4/4 with Lifelink and Vigilance on turn 3 without a whole lot of effort. The pair combined in one of the more broken Standard decks ever, which we've already mentioned numerous times, Caw-Blade. Stoneforge Mystic ended up getting banned out of Standard in June of 2011, but Batterskull continued on without them, unlike the swords, still finding play in a variety of decks since his stats were so good and difficult to race. The primary place it saw play was actually in control decks since it provided a win condition that was difficult to deal with and could put you out of range of aggro decks thanks to the life gain. But he still saw some play in aggro decks as the top of the curve threat. Batterskull also sees play in Modern, primarily in sideboard cards, as a good card against aggro decks where the life gain can make it difficult to finish you, and also as a way for control decks and combo decks to side into a more creature-based strategy. The Skull has seen mainboard play in Modern, though, especially in Blue Moon decks, where it is one of the primary win conditions after you lock your opponent out of their mana. In Legacy and Vintage, Stoneforge Mystic is legal, and that means that Batterskull is a good card there, and so it sees play regularly in those 2 formats. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. If you have any suggestions for future Top 10s, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you catch my future MTG Top 10s, Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.